Hey guys, Zane here with another one-take review, and today I want to talk about the new Porcupine Tree album, Closure Continuation. Closure Continuation, or Closure/Continuation if that's what you would prefer to call it, as that's technically what the title is the latest studio album from progressive rock/metal legends Porcupine Tree. Having been on a studio hiatus since 2009's The Incident, many have taken the time from the band off to sort of reevaluate their now over 30 years of performing as a really excellent and even to some extent historic piece of progressive rock history. While frontman Steven Wilson's solo projects were surely enough to hold fans of Porcupine Tree over until the entire band came riding back into town, this record is an example of a band making a comeback album that's just as strong and worth your time as their more iconic releases. All of these years later, Porcupine Tree still managed to maintain the same level of technical complexity that they always have and have even on their most brilliant and their most underrated albums. From extended song lengths to breakdowns that would challenge even the masters of the guitar, the bass, and the drums, Porcupine Tree's work on Closure Continuation is just as compositionally impressive as anything else in the band's catalog. Porcupine Tree, throughout every single record they've released, through every minor lineup change that they've had, have been accused of being too self-indulgent for their own good, and that's definitely something that could be argued here as well. And I mean, quite frankly, it's a pretty valid argument as well. I'm not going to lie to you and say that Porcupine are not a self-indulgent band. They absolutely are. But in my eyes, that's only because Porcupine Tree, and in general, but especially this record, Closure Continuation, is kind of tailor-made for people that have already involved themselves in the work of equally progressive rock and metal bands, or even more progressive bands. The deep influences from the likes of Gentle Giant, Hawkwind, and even more famous acts like Pink Floyd are very obvious throughout Closure Continuation, as the different cuts that Porcupine Tree decided to leave as the ultimate album are hardly listenable if you just truly do not understand the point of progressive rock, and that's understandable. It's a genre that's meant for a very specific audience, like any other very niche genre, but if you can't get into the style, you certainly won't be able to enjoy this record, or for that matter, pretty much any other Porcupine Tree album. Because otherwise, Porcupine Tree's latest album is just going to come across as a sort of over-the-top beast that's more focused on doing something technically accomplished than it is to do anything actually interesting to a casual listener, and that's because, I mean, it kind of is, really. Ultimately, this is meant to appeal to the progressive rock crowd, and because of that, it really just indulges in those progressive rock tendencies. Unfortunately, Porcupine Tree's comeback does have a good amount of weak spots as well that definitely rank it below some of their better records. A lack of melodicism and memorable song progression causes this record in particular to not really stand up to their albums like 2002's In Absentia, which is now a stone cold classic of the specific niche it belongs to. Records like that were defined by their combination of technical ability and melody, and unfortunately, Closure Continuation just decides to focus on the technical ability aspect. This results in an album that, although musically impressive, is ultimately somewhat forgettable to some extent, or at least not totally, but at least somewhat forgettable. In the moments where the band does rely on a more sense of melody, ultimately sees us kind of get a peek into what the record could have been. I'm talking about tracks like Rat's Return, for example, songs that really take the sense of melody that they once had and combine it with their new sense of slick polish, not to say that they weren't ever a polished band, they always have been, but a very, very modern polish, and it's just really a great example of what this record truly could have been in terms of greatness. Not to say it's bad, but still, a general lack of melody does hold it back somewhat. While, as to be expected from Porcupine Tree, this is a very complex album, it's just unfortunate that it can't really stand out in a non-technical way. Nonetheless, Closure Continuation still feels like one of Porcupine Tree's most well-thought-out moments to date. While there may be a couple passages here or there that do feel ultimately a bit unnecessary, the record overall is actually pretty short by Porcupine standards. It's just under 50 minutes in length, and that kind of means that Closure Continuation sets out to do whatever it wants to do in a fairly condensed time frame. For a band that, similar to many of their progressive peers, tends to enjoy dropping albums that go on for an hour or longer than that, it's unusual to see such a short record from Porcupine Tree, and it's surely a result of the fact that this is technically a reunion album of sorts, even though they, never actually broke up, but you get my point. One of the biggest problems with even the greatest Porcupine Tree albums, and the reason why I personally believe they've never dropped a true masterpiece of a record, is the fact that a lot of their albums' middle sections are filled with unnecessary jams and filler. However, thanks to the short length of the album, Closure Continuation's mystical and at times menacing atmosphere is consistently effective, as the record never really gets a chance to become masturbatory in any particular way. So overall, Closure Continuation is a solid comeback for Porcupine Tree, though not exactly as great as I'm sure many people would like. While it definitely is a record made to be appreciated by those who are already pre-established fans of progressive rock and metal, this is an album that will hopefully please the majority of Porcupine Tree fans, as this is just sort of a light, shorter version of what the band normally does. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. My one take for this album is that although it is disappointing that the lack of melody is very apparent here, and that as far as memorability goes, it isn't very high ranking generally speaking, the technical abilities of the 3 current members of Porcupine Tree being put to such a reasonable length and such a well thought out record generally speaking is absolutely fantastic to hear. I would only recommend this to Porcupine Tree fans or people who are really into progressive rock and metal with a sort of alternative sound, as this definitely isn't something for beginners to the band or the genre generally speaking. Even with anything that you could potentially consider musical blemishes aside, this is definitely something that I could easily recommend to anybody who's a fan of the style, fan of the band, but not something that I could easily recommend to someone who's a fan of neither. So again, overall, 3.5 stars out of 5, and with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I will see you guys in the next one.